This is Jim. Can you hear us now, Jim?
I can now. Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let's talk about when we say a fact sheet, what we mean by that. And this is a list of information that we would envision putting in a fact sheet, and whether that's 1 page or 2 pages or whatever, the information that's available. We would have a definition of the augmentation project that would lean very heavily on the definitions we've produced previously. We would talk about where this particular project could be applied and where it may not be relevant, so that if people in different planning areas are reviewing these, they have some basis for judging, is this project appropriate for me or not? Then we have some of the important information like a range of the water yield, a range of cost per acre foot. We would look at what kinds of augmentation methods are used, because some of the projects require multiple methods to bring a complete package together. And then we would identify information such as permits, non-site specific environmental issues, rules or regulatory changes that might be required, political, technical, and public acceptance challenges, and then put some reference sources for additional information if somebody wanted to investigate. Now, this list in a large measure reflects a number of the items that are on the Category 1, 2, and 3 evaluation criteria that we worked on in the first technical memorandum that we provided. It does not go down to site-specific level information, because our sense is that given the size of this project, it's not very practical to go down to a specific site for a brackish desalination project or what have you. But we wanted to focus on furthering the definitions of these if that's what is going to go to the various planning areas, with less emphasis on comparing different projects against each other. And after we go through an explanation of those projects, I think it'll be clear to you why it is we're suggesting that. And we wanted to share this with you up front so that you could kind of see where it is we're going, so that you can ask questions and think about things as we go through. We also wanted just to highlight some of the big projects that we didn't put on this list, and it doesn't mean that we couldn't put them on, but there were reasons why we did not. And so I wanted to state what didn't go on the list, as well as going over what did go on the list. And these are some of the big projects that in theory could provide a lot of water. So I'll just go through these briefly. The Snake River or other river in the Columbia River Basin, bringing water from there down to here through some mechanism. The challenge with that is that it's illegal to take water out of the Columbia River Basin as laws sit currently. And some of the rivers, like the Snake River specifically, they have a fair amount of water in the spring runoff, but then once you get past that time for the rest of the year, it's all diverted for agriculture in Idaho. The Bear River in Utah is committed for development along the Wasatch Front, and if we're talking about augmentation of several million acre feet, I don't know that there's really enough water in that river to accomplish that goal. The Rio Grande River is already tied up in a lot of litigation and conflicts, and there's not necessarily excess water there. When we looked at snowpack and water rights on the Front Range of Colorado, Denver has already grabbed a lot of those. And we have another idea of Oregon and Washington areas are not terribly interested in the reclaimed water. Perhaps we could use that in some form or another by running a pipeline and maybe doing some exchanges and running maybe through some stream channels in Nevada to get down to here to do an exchange. But here again, you've got high costs and permitting is going to be difficult. So these are the ones that have been suggested in various ways that we didn't put on the list. So now let's go to, and we'll just step you through the various maps and explain what they are and why we have them. This first map lists the various Indian reservations and nations in Arizona, and they've been classified based on information I believe came from SRP as far as whether they have been adjudicated, resolved, not resolved, or partially resolved. And so you can see there are significant land areas in the state that are affected by these Indian water rights. I've just shown the Indian reservation lands on this map. And the purpose of this map is to make the point that there are some issues that we can't fully resolve in a water augmentation project if the project is influenced by these water rights settlements that have not yet taken place.
Well, I think even more so, the lack of settlement will complicate any augmentation project, and probably settlement would be a factor in an investment in an augmentation project.
Probably the most important.
Yeah. Not only for the tribal claims, but also for the state law claims.
And so really any augmentation project that we would propose or suggest, its viability is contingent upon issues that could be related to these Indian water rights settlements. So now if we go into the next map, this map also addresses similar issues. It has to do with water rights adjudications on the Little Colorado River and on the Gila River. On this one, we have shaded all of the areas that are affected potentially by those water right adjudications. And as you can see, there's a large portion of the state that is affected by this. And so here again, we wanted to make the point that projects that we might define and come up with are contingent upon these settlements. In particular, on the 0 to 60-year project list, making some of those projects work could potentially involve some exchanges or transfers of water using some of the natural streams and rivers that we have here in Arizona, and that really can't be done as long as there are unsettled adjudication issues. Any questions or thoughts on those two maps before we move on?
No, I think those are very good points, though, and I mean, as Sarah said as well. I mean, especially when you're looking that far out, and less than until the adjudications ever get resolved, it's going to make it very difficult to do the transportation piece, if nothing else.
Yes.
You know, in an early GWAC meeting, it was brought up, a suggestion was brought up that the committee affirm a principle that claims need to be settled before an augmentation project takes place. I think that was before the first report, and the committee declined to do it. In part, I think because there hadn't really been much of an opportunity to discuss it, and we were under some time pressure to get the report out. But it's something this committee may want to consider. It really is hard for me to imagine public financing for some augmentation projects where there's a real question about who is the customer base for that project because the water rights aren't resolved. Yeah.
Well, particularly as it relates to surface water. I mean, if you're talking about stormwater runoff or some other stuff that you...
Where it's clear, yeah.
You know, I think the biggest augmentation project might just be, or the best might just be, installing new adjudication judges and special masters.
See, for the short term, right?
Yeah.
Right, get it moving.
We'll let you write that chapter.
Oh,
Yeah. And sign your name to it as well.
I don't think everyone would be as excited about that as you. I'm there with you.
But given the significance of these issues, one of my questions for the committee is, you know, to what extent you want us to say something in the final report to highlight that these things need to be taken care of before some of the projects can actually be brought to fruition.
It does make sense that for those projects that would be affected by these issues, to at least acknowledge that. I mean, some of them are going to be more affected than others.
Yes.
You know, and if we're talking about utilizing surface water rights in areas that have not yet been adjudicated and there's no water right certainty, then that's a much bigger concern.
I think it goes beyond that. There's an assumption made about who is the customer base for a project, and if you don't have water rights certainty in the area, you don't have certainty about the customer base. I think it goes beyond only augmentation that involves surface rights.
Yeah,
And we don't need to issue a proposed mandate that rights need to be resolved before there can be in public financing or before there can be augmentation, but we should explain that it's clear that the adjudication isn't an impediment to the development of different augmentation projects.
Right. I think, yeah, something that at least as a minimum, a footnote that's asterisk to the appropriate projects that says, resolution of Indian settlements and the adjudication may be a precondition to bringing these projects to fruition, which is different than studying them, but I mean actually implementing them.
And maybe Scott and I could, if Scott would be willing, we could work on some proposed language that explains this.
Yes.
And then that could be kind of the go-to reference point.
Bill, did you have a comment?
Depending on the timing of a project, then these may not be impediments.
It might be the reason for the settlement.
Could be.
It might be a tool to get a settlement done, right, which would be good too. Right. Yeah, so I think of since you two very nicely volunteered to come up with that language, let's incorporate, it may be an opportunity, in both the Indian settlements and the adjudications to assist in moving forward. And so, Richard, you have some help on.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Now let's jump into the projects, and I want to first explain some of our logic and the approach that we took in how we grouped them and how we organized them. The first thing we did, now we got project ideas. We have some from the committee. We have some from our own experience. We asked around. We talked to the Nature Conservancy, and we talked to Sarah, and a variety of people to get ideas to try and supplement or augment the ideas that we had. And so the project list is a compilation of those. We grouped them in some ways that made sense to us. And one way of grouping them is by timing. So there are projects that we thought could feasibly be done in 10 years, then we put those in one group. And so I would tend to call those, the easier ones, the quick wins. Internally in our project team, we had some debates on some of them, such as, if we needed to implement some sort of a irrigation non-expansion area or active management area or something in areas of the state that did not have those. Some members of our committee thought, well, it only takes a year to do that, and that's really important. Maybe it should be in the first 10 years. And yet there were other thoughts that, politically, maybe it could happen in a year or two. The reality is, by the time you work it through the political process, it may take 10 years. And so that influenced the grouping of what went in the first 10 years and then in the 10 to 30-year time period. And when I say 10 to 30-year time period, what I mean is the time when that project could come to fruition. That does not mean when we start the project. And so you'll notice in some of the things we've changed recently, we said 0 to 10, 0 to 30, and 0 to 60. Because even projects that might take 50 or 60 years to happen, you may need to start soon. Another differentiator is on brackish groundwater desalination. For municipalities today, the price point just isn't there yet. That does not mean it won't happen in the future as the price of water goes up and as the cost of managing brackish groundwater and brine goes down. So we intentionally put those projects into 10 to 30-year time period because we thought that's when they realistically could happen. Then the third time period, where projects would come into fruition between 30 and 60 years, is when we put very big projects, very large projects, and those projects also we define and group them in a couple different ways. One is we had big projects such as a ocean desalination project that could be used to get water to Arizona, and then we had a series of other projects that are smaller that were more specific as to how to get water brought to Arizona to a specific planning area. Then another way that we looked at and grouped projects is we went planning area by planning area and asked ourselves the question, well, what makes sense? What could be realistic or feasible for a particular planning area? And then we put those ideas down as well. So if we look at this first map of the 0 to 10 year time period, there are, let's just talk through sort of what we mean by the various icons that we place in the various planning areas and what they mean. Some of them are very general, and there are a few that are very specific about individual projects that we put there. That's one question in my mind where I would be interested in some feedback from the committee is, do you want to be as specific as we are on some of the specific projects or not? You can see there's water, the drop. Water drop represents water conservation. We put those in most of the planning areas. As we talked in our meeting in October, the idea is that water conservation can be used wherever it is beneficial based on a variety of criteria that is most applicable to people in a particular planning area. There may be some cities that are already doing all they can, and so that wouldn't necessarily be one that they would pick and use. There may be other cities that haven't addressed that. Another one that is very common is reclaimed water. And that icon is really a representation of three types of the use of reclaimed water, which would be direct potable reuse, aquifer storage and recovery, and direct reuse. And we didn't try and specify which application would be best in each area. It may vary city or town by town.
What were the three again? I'm sorry, direct reuse,
Direct
storage,
reuse,
recovery.
aquifer storage and recovery, and direct potable reuse.
So direct reuse is just the purple pipe system to the golf courses and direct potable is
Drinking it.
Toilet to town.
full recycle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Although in this case, our hope is that the direct reuse goes to an industrial application or agriculture or probably something other than
And curiosity, I know some areas of the state very well. Other areas of the state I'm not nearly as, so I'm not answering your question, but I have a question about, in the Verde, which is one of the areas I'm very familiar with, I'm wondering why there isn't the little recharge icon isn't included in that.
the recharge.
The recharge of planned and storm water. It's down in Cochise,
Okay.
it's upper St. Vincent.
The reason that it's not there, and this is something you can discuss if you wanted, was we tried to not put the recharge icon in areas where there could be, for stormwater, in areas where there could be water rights issues. You know, for example, where Salt River Project may have a claim on the water and they are hoping that that water goes through the cycle to come to them as opposed to be captured and held. And so
Captured before it hits the river, though.
that's correct.
Yeah. I'm familiar with SRP's position on that, but I think if you're capturing it as sheet flow or as somewhere else, and it's not in a natural channel, I don't think you need to worry about that issue, but I understand. But reuse of recycled water is certainly something, right, that we want to continue to do, or do more smartly than we are.
Yes, and we do have that icon there in the Verde Valley area, which we realize there are opportunities to do more with reclaimed water.
I'm wondering if we want to, I'm going back a little bit, I'm sorry, but if we want to drop the water conservation icon and instead have a blanket statement that's to the effect that everyone can do more conservation, or that we, you know, I mean, the whole GWAC has stated we should always try to do more conservation somewhere or other. The reason is that conservation, to me, is not the same as augmentation. It stretches supplies, but it doesn't provide new supplies. And it's so ubiquitous here, even though, you know, it's appropriate as a recommendation. I think it might get rid of a tiny bit of clutter to take it out. So I just throw that out there as a suggestion.
So anybody else have comments on that, the committee members?
I'll chime in.
Oh,
The reason
okay.
I was discussing this yesterday, that was actually his exact comment, with conservation, trying to identify if that was being done as an augmentation project, who would be the beneficiary of it, that sort of thing. So he was saying the same thing, a simple sentence or statement at the beginning of the report would probably be a good thing to have, but nothing beyond that.
Okay, so let's do it the other way. Do any of the committee members object to just doing the statement on conservation and taking it off this map so it doesn't clutter? I mean, I think that's good.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll just, I mean, leave our sheet in there where it says water conservation is one of these things that everybody can do, but not listed as an augmentation project.
Maybe even explain that we were trying to focus on augmentation.
Right.
Expanding the portfolio.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
I have a question for clarity. Is that both agricultural conservation as well as municipal?
Let my ag people jump in here, please.
Are you talking about, does it include all conservation, or are we limiting it? What's the question? I'm not sure I understand.
The question is that there's two icons on here, that one is agricultural conservation and the other is municipal conservation. So when you're talking about taking those icons off and just making a general statement, does it also include the agricultural conservation?
From my perspective, it does.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense to treat all the conservation the same, because it goes back to, otherwise you open that door about who gets the water
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
conserved. And the idea is that it makes the farming more efficient, but, you know, which we all want to do and which we've said about the cities as well, but again, it's not being
so that the
done.
cities
The
can
conservation, agricultural conservation is not being done to generate more water. It may result in more water available, and then you get in, you know, for exchange, but the conservation itself would be just being done to be more efficient.
Right.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that's consistent. I understand there's the discussion that if we can get ag to be more efficient, then that frees up water for M&I use, but I would argue that the agricultural community would not agree, and that if we're saving, you know, to the extent we have those agricultural savings, they then are available for additional agricultural uses. And Bruce, you came in right at the same time, so feel free to jump in. Reed already, yes, and Reed already passed on your comment, and the committee has already given direction that we're going to take the water conservation icon off this map. But then the question to Wade was, do we also take off the agricultural conservation icon to be consistent? And I think the answer to that's yes.
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you can make a statement up front in the report how important conservation
Oh,
is.
yeah,
and,
right.
all the-
Encourage, it's good stuff, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not important, but really not augmentation.
Okay, great, thanks.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
So, Richard, and I can't believe I didn't ask you this question before, but where I'm getting confused is, so you said the implement reclaimed water systems includes direct potable, annual storage and recovery, and direct reuse. So it has a recharge component in it. So your little basin has recharge reclaimed. So basically, that recharge reclaimed, isn't that incorporated in the implement reclaimed water systems?
You can certainly argue that there is some overlap there.
Because I think that's what's confusing, if you just say recharge stormwater, because
I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole.
to me, if there is the overlap, that everywhere that you have one of those, you should have one of those, but you're saying you didn't do it because of the stormwater component. Am I the only one confused by that?
Yes, and there's kind of an assumption here as well that at least in my mind.
Kind of like,
Implement reclaimed water systems, in my mind, that's intended
I don't know, it's a
for
rabbit hole.
a city or a town to use the reclaimed water that they have within their area.
Treated water.
Yes, and that's a little bit different than, let's say, what happens along the San Pedro River, where there are projects planned for recharge, some of which are reclaimed water and some of which are storm water. And I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't have the sense that reclaimed water is necessarily intended for the municipality where that reclaimed water originated.
What the use is for now?
It's for augmenting the river.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Groundwater that augments the river, I mean, it is not being reclaimed, it's not being withdrawn again and utilized, right? It's not in the sense of banking. It's not what it's doing.
If there's something you want us to do to adjust the definitions to make it more of a distinction or clearer, we can do that.
And I did not refer back to the definitions of that, so it's probably just my confusion.
Okay.
I was talking to Maureen, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the concern, so I don't know if I answered the question, Jerry, correctly, but in a nutshell, I'm sorry.
Well, I just thought that I was a little bit confused because the implement reclaimed water systems has those three components that includes recharge, and I was wondering how that was different from than the other icon that says recharge reclaimed water. I saw those as being the same, so I thought to answer your question about why it wasn't in the Verde system, did it make more sense because if you remove just the reclaimed portion of that little statement, is it just recharging stormwater? But he said it's not, using the San Pedro example that
there might be reclaimed water that is not part of the municipal, that is not going back into the municipal.
Well, that's true, and then when I was thinking of the Verde, I mean, we're looking at doing very similar things we're doing in San Pedro, and mostly that's to bolster stream flow.
It's not actually an augmentation project.
It's not an augmentation project in that sense, yeah. Right. I mean, it could be if it raises groundwater levels generally, and, you know, but...
Oh, yeah, let's open that door.
We're increasing.
Who invited you to come?
We're bolstering the subflow zone.
There you
Good
go.
thing.
So, I mean, what do we think? Do we leave it or not?
Another differentiation is that the implement reclaimed water systems also includes upgrading wastewater treatment facilities from lagoons, for example, to mechanical plant that can produce reclaimed water of a quality that you can do something more than is currently being done.
Okay, so maybe it goes back to the definition thing.
Yeah.
So, so I think there is, Jerry, I mean, are you happy with Richard's answer that there is a difference between them? So maybe what we need to do, Richard, is give some thought to maybe how we can add a couple words on this legend to make that distinction accurate.
Okay, we can do that.
All right, thank you.
I've got a question on
Sure.
the same term. On the Colorado River Indian tribes, it has the symbol for implement reclaimed water systems. I don't understand why that's an augmentation project. It's a return flow to the Colorado River.
Well, I think if they were to, well, I mean, it's return flow now, but would it have to be return flow? Could it not generate water for reuse on the reservation?
I mean, new water.
You know?
Yeah, it's just a different color.
Bill has spoken. Did you get that on the tape?
So you're saying then you want that to remove from the Colorado Mainstream North?
Unless you've got another source other than the return flow. Yeah, it's not new water.
Okay.
Well, wait.
Well,
But that's not all reservation.
Never knew.
Yeah, it's for the entire
Planning area.
planning area.
The question is who uses it, not is it new water or not, but how is the water used is really how we're defining augmentation.
Could you, I apologize, I was out for a while for surgery and I'm just getting back into this. What is the definition of
Well,
augmentation?
I think it'd be good if we
Yeah,
talked
because I
about
look at
that,
lining
because I think
canals and that's what I got off
yeah.
with Maureen on, and I'm like, is that
But that's
augmentation? Is that?
conservation, But if you think about how, the department has a sort of, I think, a kind of good definition of augmentation, right? Or of reuse.
Jerry, come on, Jerry.
No idea.
I was
Why don't we
thinking,
define it?
if you're,
We could do that.
if you're a municipal water
Do it.
strategist or planner, and you see taking treated water and expanding your portfolio, that's augmentation.
Yes.
You have more
New
water.
water.
It's new water in your portfolio. Whereas if you recharged it into a river and it flowed away, it would not be new water. So it's really, is it portfolio
And
expanding? Is it
too
more water
philosophical,
for
but
use?
if you do conservation, explain the difference then. You now have more water in your portfolio.
That's supply stretching.
Yeah.
You have the same amount of water in your portfolio. You have 100,000
Okay,
acre
I
feet
mean,
and a million users. And you
Seems to me
you
there's
can add,
distinction there without
that
not
just
much
means
of a
you can add
difference, but I
users.
understand
You're not
that.
adding the acre feet.
Right,
But
you're
I
not
think-
getting more acre feet, you're
Yeah.
getting more people.
No, I
served
get,
by
I get that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you're not getting more acre feet, but you are. It's a tricky
You're getting
kind
more
of-
users.
Yeah. Well,
But when we for municipalities, we do treat reclaimed water as a component of the portfolio.
Right.
And we treat conservation as something sort of the same, but it's more, this is a water resource that you now don't have to go out and get.
As opposed to an expanded portfolio. So I think that's
Even though with
different.
conservation, sometimes you do need to invest,
yeah.
you know.
Yes.
And I do understand the nuanced distinction,
Yeah.
but then you look at agricultural water conservation, municipal water, and what about lining canals?
Well, lining canals, I'm grappling with. The only thing is, my only objection to having conservation all over this map, my main one is,
It clutters.
it's cluttering, and we all, like, we should always be leading with conservation.
Yeah, that's,
And then the other thing is the question of when ag conserves, you know, who has designs on the water
Well,
that's
there's some water
conserved?
rights
And
issues there that aren't even clear.
So we
Right, I
want to be careful
know.
of that and not,
Yeah.
we don't need to, you know, go there at all. And so then I think we should look at what's of value to, what's this project about? What's of value? We already get the conservation thing. We all get that.
and the issue of lining of canals, lining of canal in and of itself doesn't mean you're necessarily saving water. Because when that canal's in line, it's augmenting the groundwater supply
Right.
potentially, but if you divert less water due to the fact that you're lining the canal, now you save
Yeah.
water, and
Yeah.
it's more of a conservation item.
Or-
So just the lining in and of itself
It
isn't
depends on-
necessarily a water saving.
So it's neither.
Neither conservation nor augmentation.
Yeah.
Right, and it could have impact
Yeah.
on your groundwater
Right,
table
right.
potentially.
And on other users.
Other users.
Return flows.
So,
Although if you take, for the example, Buckeye Water Conservation and Drainage District, they do augment the groundwater, but in a place where
It doesn't need it.
it doesn't need it, and they do put restrictions on their irrigators through the summer because they don't have enough water to serve all of them all that they would like. And
that's probably because they don't have enough homes.
The other thing, I want to circle back to what Bill brought up with reclaimed water being on the Colorado being zoned and all of that. I think to the extent where there is wastewater that's being discharged to septic tanks and isn't easily quantifiable as part of return flow, that
Yeah.
where it is on the right line, where you mechanically collect all of that water, treat it in one location, and then you're more intentional about it, I think that's kind of what we're thinking about along the Colorado.
You can estimate that, of course.
Right.
But we know that septic also recharges, right? So,
But if you want certainty,
yeah,
you can
and if
put
you
it
want to
through
do
one
something
flow
with it, yeah,
and know at a reclaimed water plant what you get.
yeah.
Well, and I think, am I correct, Richard, in that, the point in that is, there is at least one city in the main stem south, Quartzsite, that is not using Colorado River water, is using groundwater.
Right.
They're theoretically not within the non-existent accounting surface.
Right.
So, they could collect their reclaimed water and utilize it. I don't know that there's actually a municipality of any size in Mainstem North that's outside of the theoretical accounting surface or doesn't have the contractual obligation associated with saying anything that they pump.
It's Colorado.
River water.
It's Colorado River water, right,
Right.
right.
However, Bullhead City is somehow participating in the pilot system conservation program, so they're obviously conserving some way.
Right, now, exactly, to create
I think
additional
it's,
water.
I think,
Yeah, so I think it is,
That is
it's for there, yeah, I think that's right, I think that pilot project has definitely opened the door to that discussion. There's also, I mean, like Havasu City steward their entire community, but there are still a number of communities, including a large part of Bullhead City, that are not yet steward. So there really is the opportunity there to, I mean, and then you get into, is that conservation or is that augmentation? Well, I would argue, I know when we sold that tremendous, usually ridiculous bond issue in Havasu to do the sewer system, I mean, really what sold that was the adding to the portfolio by getting that certainty about what water was going to be available to be reused. You know, I mean, obviously, if it goes to the river, that's a different issue, but I mean, that you would have the ability at least to capture that water and reuse it. So, I mean, I think that definitely created an additional, that definitely augmented the water supply for Lake Havasu, just as an example, because that happens to be one I'm familiar with. So I guess I think it is an option in those areas, yeah, you know.
Well, what if we're doing the recharge that we're planning on doing in the Verde, and I recognize it won't be utilized in the Verde, but it flows down to our friends in Phoenix? I mean...
Bruce a friend?
Bruce and I are not only friends, we're ex-colleagues.
Okay.
We go back a long way. And Sun Devil fans.
Okay, well, that's too bad, but...
I don't know, it does make sense to identify, because it's the lawyer in me, define them very carefully.
Yeah,
And you
but
might
I think
have
they
to-
should stay on there, but with some wording that makes it clear that they're different. Yeah, okay,
Okay.
sounds good. All right,
All right, moving on, there's also a number of these little notebook icons that represent create a water management plan. That came from the 2014 study where they stated in that report, in a number of the different planning areas, that some sort of a water management plan or study had not been done, and so they didn't have a quantification of what groundwater resources were there and the demands and so on. And so we put that on as a first step to water augmentation, not that this project would provide that. Then you'll see in the next time period we've got a similar icon to implement whatever those are. And
You know, and I kind of view that similar to the conservation piece, that you put that up front, the need to prepare these water plans and the need to get a better understanding of what's available and what isn't. Yeah, and then identify the planning areas, but I wouldn't necessarily put that as a long-term water augmentation project, per se. Well, I think when we're thinking project, I'm thinking capital.
Infrastructure.
yeah, whether it's lining the canal or a new treatment plan or right out.
But I think it's a good point, but I think it should be up front. That's
Sure.
a suggestion.
Yeah, and one of our questions later is, what of these things on this list do we want to treat like the water conservation? So I think we're saying that is one of them to treat like water conservation, the water management plan, and then we can identify those planning areas that, to our knowledge at this point, do not have them.
And it would make sense to do that. One of the other points I want to make with those is that a lot of these are in areas without a lot of population, which then raises a question, well, how it would be harder for them to fund water augmentation.
Right.
Tom, perhaps there should be a note about at the water management, when we do this sheet, that we're going to have these separate introductory sheets on the things like water conservation and this, to make some comment about, it might make sense for a number of these areas to join together to form a water management plan.
Well, that's my question, and I'm kind of interested in, it's been a while since I've brushed off the strategic vision, but are we recommending that the basin have a plan, that planning area, not a basin, but is that the recommendation, that they, as a planning area,
It was,
a plan be developed and by the department or with the assistance of the department? Isn't that kind of the idea?
Well, I think that the vision identified possibilities, it didn't identify who would do those things.
Does the strategic vision identify opportunities for multi-governmental projects at all, or sort of, you know what I mean?
I mean, it does talk about the region, yeah, it does talk about
I remember
large regional projects. I mean, just doesn't identify them or even what areas, just that,
Well, and because that immediately followed that whole idea getting slaughtered in the legislature.
right,
Yeah.
right, because it's weed, yeah.
Well, that's,
Sorry.
oh, you mean Tobin's idea. That,
The regional water augmentation authorities, yeah, that legislation.
Be replaced.
And quickly.
But the large regional, would that transcend the planning areas? If there were more than one planning area?
Right, I think that was the idea, like, for example, which we all know is pie in the sky, but if we're really looking for millions of acre feet, we kind of have to be looking at some pie in the sky things. CAP was pie in the sky when first conceived. You know, clearly it was going to take a, you know, pretty much statewide customer base to be able to support the financing of that kind of project. So, yes. And I think one of the directions of the committee to Corolla was that at the end of the day, when we look at when we narrow it down to like 4 or 5 projects for a deeper look, that we definitely wanted at least one of them to be a cross planning area project to show the benefit of areas working together. So yes, I think that we definitely anticipate that there would be. But I think the vision was that there are areas of the state that really have not even looked at water management, let alone augmentation. They haven't even looked at the management of their existing supply, and if there's things they could do, water conservation, reuse, whatever, that would at least make them more efficient with what they currently have.
Yes.
Because there's not even that kind of plan in those planning areas, that should be a first step, because without that, they don't necessarily know
right.
how much it did. Because like when we did the Water Resource Development Commission numbers, which then led to the statewide vision, there were definitely areas of the state where there was no information. And, you know, when we, you know, kind of cobbled together as best we could with representatives from those areas in the room, numbers to put in that study, but everybody recognized that that's what they were, that we cobbled together some numbers, you know, as best we could with the information that was available, but that there were areas. But we also felt that it was important that those areas do it themselves, that we wanted to avoid the state imposing a plan. That if an area came back after they did all this and said, we want to do an active management area, or we want to do an INA, that would be up to those local areas. But that the idea of this plan was that in the first instance, that local group, and with or without assistance of the state or whoever, but I mean that local area first will come up with a plan for what they currently had, how it was being managed, and what their true augmentation needs.
And so how that segued into when the water initiative was initially developed, how that segued in was with the planning area process, that knowing that they don't have this information, we would go out and provide that assistance, which has been largely derailed by DCP, but we're still going into the planning areas and doing the demand updates. The biggest thing that we've ran into in our discussions is the supplies. I mean, the demand information, we can do some good updates, and that's really what Vivian's focusing on. But the supply side, the data for the supplies is rudimentary and from the 1960s, that there's some millions of acre feet in some area. Yeah, yeah. So that's, the big thing is understanding the supply. But
How hard is it to get that information? It must be hard, but
I'm presuming it's hard because there isn't any out there.
Well, I think particularly, I mean, because especially when you get to areas that are totally...
Without any kind of groundwater
modeling, yeah.
They can't do it. And there have been groundwater models created for so few areas in the state.
And a lot of those are controversial. I mean,
yeah. Well, it seems like that no one has any business asking for public financing of augmentation in the absence of a plan, a management plan, and in the absence of a pretty good show of conservation. And I feel like we could sort of weave that kind of idea into a blanket statement. Because how would we know if there would be a successful, investment in a project if there isn't such a plan? People are...
Right, and I
You can
think
make that a positive.
Right, and I think that could be part of the, well, sure, well, actually, that could be part of the introduction to this section of the report that talks about these things.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
talks about, that could be the introduction to that section of the report, that the reason this is important is, one, we need to know what is the true augmentation number in any given area.
Even items such as future growth, whether it's in agriculture, municipal, and tax base, and all those items will all go into play on what you can do and
Can't do it.
Yeah.
Right, exactly, and that while we have created a portfolio of options,
Some of these,
for augmentation, until you have that underlying study done in any given planning area, you will not know if those
Well,
augmentations.
we're talking about augmentation, and we just hear Jerry say, well, there's a lot of places we don't even know what the supply is. So
Right.
we're talking about,
I mean,
I
the
know what you,
volume of,
well, absolutely, but
the
it's,
volume of groundwater supply.
of course, but I mean, that would, especially when we talk about rural groundwater reform, I mean, it's gonna be very important to know, how do you even fix an area if you don't even know what the...
Right,
If maybe it doesn't need to be fixed, I mean, as some people would say, or...
that's why your plan is so important.
Yeah.
It has to be upfront.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, having said that, the majority of that millions of acre feet deficit is in the urban areas that have those plans.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Sky, I agree, we certainly need those rural studies done, because part of this whole process is to try and recognize the need to bring everybody into the fold in terms of recharge and conservation and everything else. But at the same time, we definitely can't lose sight that the big chunk of that deficit is in the urban areas where those plans currently exist.
There is kind of a proscriptive value in the plan too, though, in realistically, if you're in a place that has nothing but awful groundwater, then how big do you really think you can grow? I mean, that's something that...
And do you want to?
Highlighting it.
And do you want to end up like one of these
I think
big
another
deficit
part of that
areas?
is, do you want to?
Yeah.
I mean, and we all know that you can't in Arizona mention the concept of growth management, but if you could, there might very well be areas of the state that would be perfectly fine with that concept. Yes, yeah. Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, you discussed the points that I thought were important on that one, that these water management plans are really a prerequisite to anything else
Yeah.
that we would do for water
I
augmentation.
think Wade had a comment, Richard, before we move on.
It's good for us to sit here in this room and say, you live in an area that doesn't have a good groundwater supply or any water supply, then you shouldn't plan on growing. Yeah.
Well, no, that's why I was very clear to say
We're
they
not
would
saying
have to
that.
make.
We're not saying
That's
that.
why I said they would have to make that decision. Yes.
Yeah.
They would have to make that
Yeah, I think
determination.
that's right. We're not telling them.
No.
We're saying, here are
Do the
challenges.
plan, here's the challenges, do your plan, because you really can't move that next step to augmentation until you know what.
Well, and Jerry,
What you
tell me
have.
I'm wrong, but some of this going out, I mean, listen, some of you may know, tried to get an INA established in San Simon before I went into came to TNC, and that was roundly rejected, not just by DWR, but the locals weren't very interested in it. You have seen maybe, since you've gone out and done some of these presentations, engagement in some of these rural areas that are like, hey, what is our situation out here, really? I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
much more than it was maybe 5-6 years ago.
No, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, certainly up in Mojave, that's definitely the case.
Right.
5 years ago, if you tried to have a meeting to talk about any kind of regulation of anything, it would have been,
Right.
hang them.
I agree we don't want to cram anything down anybody's throat, but I mean, it seems in some of these areas there is a shift towards, let's get an understanding of...
Let's understand, yes.
Right.
Yeah, at least in that.
And Richard, I know this has taken a lot of time, but I feel like this is answering a lot of the questions, even though we're not necessarily taking your questions in order, but having this discussion as we go really is giving you that direction.
Yeah, I agree. This is
Okay, great, okay.
There are a few remaining items on here that we haven't talked about. We haven't talked specifically about agriculture conservation, but we have a direction on that. some regulatory revisions in a couple places, and a water transfer. This is one that's very specific on the Navajo Nation and the city of Page when the Navajo generating station goes away. And both of those entities hope to get a little bit of water from that, and so we listed that as a transfer. But that's where we have a question. Do you want us to list those kinds of projects that would be that specific or not?
No, I think. I mean, everybody else jump in. But I think water transfers, but that they have to be on a voluntary basis with the area of origin, and just kind of make that statement, and therefore we've not identified specific locations for water transfers.
Okay.
Because, do you think, I mean...
Theoretically, a water rights holder can do a transfer. I mean, a
without
water
any...
rights holder can do a transfer. It's always out there. It might be very difficult, but it's always out there.
Well, so I think,
So let's not put it on.
let's not, I guess my thought is, we definitely need to leave it on the list as an augmentation project. Water transfers are an ability to augment supplies in different areas
But
of
we're
the
not
state.
pointing out any.
But we're not recommending that in
Put a
any
big one in
specific
Mojave
area.
County, right?
Yeah, I think
I
the Mojave
dare you.
County, yeah. But I think that, well, no, in Yuma, I think. But I mean, I think we do have to recognize that over time, that may be a reasonable option, but only with the cooperation and consent of the area of origin.
And we're just there identifying water augmentation
Projects, we're just saying
as an
transfer is an option, but we're not, at this point, ready to identify a specific area for transfer.
I agree, sir. It's always an option.
Yeah,
I mean, in that regard.
Right.
But it's just an option.
But they happen, and they're at different scales. I mean, SRP is doing severing transfers all the time, all over the state. So there's small-scale transfers.
It takes forever to get through. I mean, how many of them are we waiting to get?
Versus large-scale.
And there certainly have been some transfers.
They're incredibly complicated. I would actually tie severs and transfers and water transfers to the regulatory reform piece, because, I mean,
Yeah,
it's really
I
hard.
agree with you. You think about, like, especially, depending on whose right it is, who has a lot of water.
We're trying to give them some in San Pedro, and they've been sitting in front of Lisa. I'll go give her on the way out. But, I mean, for how long? I mean...
Yeah, we've got a few in the Verde, too.
And they get...
Can I interrupt?
But what I was saying was, they are happening now in lots of places, more places than are identified on here. So they almost fall under that blanket.
Yeah.
Really, in any place where there's somebody who has water available, or is next to somebody that has water available, even in a different planning area, the option for a transfer, as Maureen said, as long as you have a willing transferer and a willing transferee.
Well, that's not
a little more
necessarily
complicated than
enough.
that.
Yeah, no, because, I mean, I can think of a couple of recent instances where there was certainly somebody willing to
There was
transfer.
willing, yeah. I'll give you my water.
So, I mean, I think you have a community aspect as well as the rights holder aspect, depending on the type of water and where it is located.
Yeah.
And Guy, you wanted to jump in here and say something?
Well, I did. There's sort of an evolution of discussion that's going toward mechanisms to get you set up to do these things. And then you also, very clearly at the beginning of this and all the way through, from what I can tell, you wanted a list of augmentation options per planning area.
Right.
That we felt like were the most feasible.
Right.
So I'm curious about not putting on the map transfers that we've identified. Is that just because it's too politically sensitive?
I don't know. I want to have that discussion because, I mean, I think I'm not ready to jump to put transfers over like where we're doing conservation and that stuff, because I do think transfer is an augmentation option, and
but you just want to leave it open to all.
To all, as opposed to identifying a specific area. I mean, I think... Yeah, I mean, unless we were to just... Import transfers, we'd all be happy with. Well, I mean, that's...
Transfers all around the board.
Well, but I think...
From out of state.
But I think that's right, but I mean, we can't ignore transfers because, you know, they're going to happen. I mean, and they are happening, and they're going to continue to happen, and it's how that they happen. And I mean, Kroll has certainly done what we asked, which is identified by planning area, and there are certainly some planning areas where certainly, at least at first blush, politics aside, which I know we can't put aside, are areas ripe for transfer. You know, so I mean, we can't, so the question is, do we leave them on the map, but with the statement that says, we have specifically, you know, where it has transfer, say, while we have indicated areas of the state where transfers might be a viable option, we have not identified specific projects, recognizing that, you know, the area of origin would need to be part of that discussion or something along those lines. I don't know. Because to me, I hate taking transfers off the map because they are an augmentation.
That's it.
Yeah, you're going to have to defend this, so go for it.
In more ways than one.
I know. Yeah, I know. I know.
I think you can describe generically what you mean by a transfer within that planning area and leave it at that.
More water into the basin and Ray J.
Or whatever, you know. I mean, and because some areas here don't have water to transfer.
Right.
And others may.
Right.
I wouldn't get into any specifics.
Yes.
Right.
Agreed.
Right. So, I mean, I think we leave it, but with a generic description to make it clear that we're not identifying specific projects in those planning areas. Right. We're only saying that. Right,
District to another entity.
But I mean,
like
here it's meant to.
Projects in Yuma.
Are we leaving it on then? Because
I think the idea was to leave it on, leave transfers on, but with the statement that we're not identifying specific projects, recognizing all the
But we are
reality.
essentially making a statement that we don't think transfers are viable in all these other places. So are we?
That was my point. If you're going to leave it on, do you put it on
Everywhere?
everywhere?
More places?
That's
Do
what
we
I'm
think-
saying, or is it more of a blanket one that you just say,
Oh,
a transfer is an augmentation option that's available to
in all the planning areas.
planning area?
I mean, right now, is it really? I mean, there are places that don't need augmentation, much less I mean,
Well, all right, let's just take, for example, the dream of some places for a CAP extension, and the Tony Davis article about how Crit was interested in 25 to 30-year leases. Those aren't reflected here on this map. The places that kind of dream of such transfers aren't reflected. Do we want to add those, or is there a reason why we're not including them?
So, Richard, how do we come up with what areas we've shown transfers in?
it gets more specific than what you...
Because his were based on specific.
Yeah, the ones on this map are all based on specific feedback we got from somewhere.
Right.
Okay.
Because, for example, Bruce and Roosevelt, your separate transfer to Payson
Yep.
Not on the map.
isn't reflected. I mean, so
But that already happened.
Right.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be augmentation because
It wouldn't be additional.
it wouldn't be additional.
Going forward.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a new.
But I guess
transfer.
you're right. One could argue that you could do transfers within the Roosevelt planning area. Yeah.
We're talking specifically about surface water, Colorado River surface water transfer. I mean, so I don't know what it says in here, but to alleviate some of the concern, you might also want to say, groundwater transfer, generally illegal. We're not considering changing that.
We're not changing the groundwater law.
Well, I mean, the real issue is, in theory, there could be transfers off to Salt and Verde if we ever had an adjudication.
Yeah, adjudication.
I mean, so it really isn't just.
Maybe we could make it.
So it really isn't just the Colorado, because, because if the adjudication were to occur, then people with rights on the Salt and Verde, for example, could,
potentially,
if they wanted to be lynched, suggest to.
I mean, that's where we hope so.
We want to live in the world where we can
Move things around.
have that happen.
It sounds to me like we need to be very clear about the prerequisites for some of these things.
Yeah.
And then on some of these that are available truly to every planning area, we just need to pull that out and say, in these timeframes, it may make sense for these augmentation ideas to be considered.
Well, and I think you break your maps up into different years, right?
Right.
So you can see where, transfers in the next 10 years can happen big boom boom in these planning areas, but these others, highly unlikely. And then 11 to 30, you could expand it a bit.
Expand it, whatever they are, yeah, and I think all with some very clear statement about.
Assumption.
That, you know, assuming water rights settlements have been resolved, assuming area of origin cooperation, assuming regulatory changes, because clearly on a lot of these, you also need, or realistically, to get them done, regulatory reform.
Regulatory reform.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. Yep, yep.
Okay,
I know you have this agreement icon.
yes.
I think we need agreements in everywhere.
All these things, so I'm not sure an agreement icon is really an augmentation project type that help me out on that.
Yeah, I understand your point.
Yeah.
It's more a matter of figuring out how do we communicate that.
Could that be in the
But we could,
fact sheet?
we could, and we could do this in such a way that anything that is a transfer, anything that requires a regulatory revision probably also requires an agreement and make that a part of the definition of that.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that makes more sense than having it as a separate, because the agreement in and of itself would not be the augmentation.
Yeah.
It's going to be the agreement to implement whatever the augmentation project is.
Right.
So let's take that off this and include it in the definitions where we need.
We're gonna have a blank map here.
No, we've not put this on here, no, and remember we left transfer on there at the risk of life.
I mean, I presume we're gonna talk about regulatory revision, we haven't yet, but I mean, that's another icon that I think could either go everywhere or nowhere. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and in this case, it's very specific, and I think that regulatory revision in Colorado Mainstream North is related to some of the water firming that I think you were talking about, Maureen, and you were saying, well, okay, for some of that requires a regulatory change, and I'm not recalling off the top of my head which part of that was there, but that's...
Well, I think, it looks, am I missing? It looks to me like regulatory revision is in every planning area, isn't it?
You're looking at the second,
This little,
The second one
Yeah.
is...
only on one, on the first one, I think.
oh, yeah, in the first one, okay.
It's over.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think on the next, map.
I mean, if you're gonna have transfers, might as well have regulatory revision.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah, so the next map, I think, has it on everything but the Bill Williams. The only one I see it missing.
All right, well, let's talk about the next map then, the 0 to 30 year time period. We've already sort of addressed the water management plan recommendations, so we can take that off. We've talked about regulatory revisions, and there's, if you look at the sheet on that, there are a number of, the icon itself is a catch-all for multiple kinds of things, some of which you may want, some of which you may not want at all. Where we have, one idea is creating a water market. The aquifer management program is another one, such as in the Cochise area where there's a lot of groundwater mining. Aquifer development, which maybe change the regulations to allow some flexibility to count water.
Now, Warren was very opposed to that.
Okay.
I promised I'd make his comments soon since he couldn't be here. To any suggestion that we were going to look at doing aquifer development in the AMAs.
I'm not surprised at that.
Yeah. So I'm just trying, I don't know what we want to do about that.
what specifically is meant by aquifer?
That's where currently they only count water down to 1,000 feet. This would be allowing them to go deeper where that is.
Yeah.
Or as that becomes a boon for development, but other people may not like that at all.
Now, I have an aquifer development option potentially here in the valley, is we have about another 2 million acre feet of storage behind Roosevelt that's for flood control space. If we could store water longer behind that reservoir and slowly release it through the valley here, we can help augment this aquifer. There's an aquifer management program.
Have a river?
For a while.
So,
Don't tell the real Sawato folks that.
I know, because they might think,
Yeah,
you know, it doesn't happen very often, but every 20, 30 years, we might get 2 to 3 million acre feet coming off that watershed.
Charge Paul?
Yeah, slowly but surely, it'll make it to
So if I'm
lower
understanding-
yield water users.
You have to keep that empty now?
Yeah, right now, yeah, we have some restrictions on how long we can keep
I
the
got
water
you.
out of the reservoir.
evacuate out of that.
Things.
Right, okay.
Yeah, Reed understands it.
Okay, and then you're saying, well, let's change that.
Let's change that.
so maybe, looking at Warren's concern,
But that's different than Warren's.
well, no, it is, but I'm just thinking that in terms of instead of limiting the discussion of aquifer development regulatory revision, we make that broader to not just, because that was his concern
Yeah.
about groundwater, and that we
Yeah.
say, look at both surface and groundwater regulations to determine.
And ours is more of a regulatory revision, a revision associated with the core, limits and operating structures associated with flood control. So that would be a regulatory revision, I guess. Not really regulatory.
Well, not necessarily a regulatory revision as much as a revision of that one project.
Yeah.
And then you would envision getting groundwater storage credits?
I don't think we would really want anything outside of we know that we're helping to recharge the aquifer that's within the project and anybody else that might benefit downstream. We're going to raise everyone.
You guys are good guys.
I think contrary to popular
I mean,
opinion.
just from a resource management perspective, okay.
I think it's a
Well,
great
where
idea.
we are is on the discussion of regulatory revision and where it should be on the map, whether
Yeah.
we should limit it to certain areas or whether we should make it statewide.
I mean, if you're talking about, if it's broad like that, it
It should be statewide.
yeah.
Yeah.
And to take a statewide look at areas where regulatory changes could facilitate better use of existing or new resources.
And I'm going to offer up Reed to maybe give you kind of as an example. We could give this as an example, may not be regulatory.
Sure.
That could help
Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
resource management. And you could do that potentially in other areas of the state too. I don't know what the infrastructure is like in some of these other dams, which leads to another question I had, is that we didn't even include anything on here, not that it would be easy and not that there is any extra water, but we didn't even talk about any, developing any additional storage in the state.
How about upstream of Horseshoe?
In the Verde Valley?
Yeah, we can build a big giant dam up there. You guys okay with that?
But, those are always options out into the future. We just didn't even address it. And maybe, I don't know what areas I guess you could identify a few areas where you have existing surface water flow where it might make sense, but we haven't even.
Very few.
Very
right?
few. No, you're right.
Does that necessarily give you more water? I mean, you're storing more. I guess it
You're
gives you
storing.
more if you're letting it go during other times, but.
Depends on where it goes.
Depends on where it goes.
Depends on what you do.
Yeah, there are a lot of issues.
Yeah.
I
There's a
agree.
few environmental concerns that might be there.
I thought we were done with
Change is going to
storage.
be a good thing.
Okay, all right, yeah, all right.
Protecting the
That's true. Listen, we're all over that now. Climate is big, yeah.
Okay, so back to, hate to keep bringing us back, but we only still have another 40 minutes and a lot to cover.
Change. We say aridification.
So we want to
That's a new- okay.
So we want to do regulatory revision, at least by the time we get to the 0 to 30 years as available, as something to look at in any planning area.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Okay.
There are some other projects on this map that I was seeing as somewhat preparatory to some of the ones on the next map. And that has to do with the CAP canal, where, and some of this is already underway now anyway, but currently, our CAP water users can peak their flows a little bit. If they change to where they had to take a constant supply throughout the year, and then each city did their own aquifer storage and recovery to manage their peaks, then the thought is that that might allow us to run the CAP canal at capacity throughout the year, in theory, if there was water to put through the canal.
Now, without creating additional CAP capacity, you mean, that with the existing, it would free up capacity within the existing system? Is that what you're?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's the intent.
Yeah, and that's another one that Warren has a comment that, well, it might be an 11-30-year time frame, suggests CAWCD construct recovery infrastructure to facilitate exchanges without limiting them to firming activities. Not sure if CAWCD is authorized or should do this. I just passed that on. I promised I'd mention all of it.
And I wasn't necessarily meaning that they would be the ones to do that. They could. And I realize there are issues with some of the current aquifer storage facilities, like Tonopah. When you go to recover that water, the quality is
right.
Significantly.
May not be able to, yeah, realistically.
I also was trying to think, well, how can we use the West Basin areas as a part of that, perhaps to provide water during some times of the year to augment what comes out of the Colorado River as one idea. As another idea, people could buy into that water supply and use that to firm some of their lower water rights. And so I'm wondering if those basin areas could be used as a storage and recovery facility in a broader context than what we currently look at, to be able to maximize the throughput through the CAP canal.
So the idea was basically creating, kind of going back to Bruce's question, creating an additional storage capacity in the West, because obviously the West Basin has no water. We have people in here coming to one of our meetings talking about they have no water in their wells. So that's, obviously the area has no water currently, at least a large portion of it does not. The idea is to create an additional, some kind of recharge facility there. I mean, I know there are some recharge facilities there, but additional recharge capacity there, storage, kind of going back to Bruce's question about are we looking at creating additional storage? I mean,
Not for them, right? I mean, storing CAP water is
it's not
them.
for the West Basins.
Yeah.
They may very well object. On the other hand, kind of going back to this cross-basin planning area projects, you know, if you create a recharge facility for CAP water, and you look at what the benefit of that is, maybe there is some way that you take a cut to the aquifer kind of thing, which I understand, you know, we're looking at opening CAP kind of gets to be a mess. But I mean, at the same time, I mean, you'd look at if there's some benefit to the surrounding area that they might not object to that kind of, you know, proposal.
And I think the
CAP
benefit there is
contract.
that you are sort of baselining the flow of the CAP and maximizing its full capacity by doing this. If you could take water and get it into recharge basins, basically think of it as a second Lake Pleasant. You're putting it into this and then you pull it back out when you need it. You're baselining the CAP canal all the time, and you're not worrying about the peaking demands for both farming as well as the treatment plant.
So operationally, how does CAP, I mean, and this is totally a rhetorical question, I know you don't know the answer to that, but how does CAP, you know, address that? Because I know that they use off-peak times for operational downtime, maintenance, that sort of thing. So how would that impact their ability? Is it reasonable to presume that that would be something that CAP could even deal with?
It seems like we would still have to do it in a way that allows them to do the maintenance that they need.
Yeah.
Without working out
I think it would
specifics.
increase the flexibility of that, actually.
How often they're at peak?
Decrease the price of water too.
What's that?
We did, because now you're pumping during peak times.
Yeah.
Well, the question is it something we should leave on the list to look at or no?
I think it's worth maybe.
Leaving it on to look at it. I mean, I think.
Maximize the use of the canal facility.
Right, a general statement about the advantage of creating a, recharge facility to help manage the peak times on the canal. I mean, it seems to me to make sense. I mean, it seems like cities do stuff to try and manage the peaks.
And if we did one of those big projects that's going to bring more water in, we need to be looking at how are we going to use the CAP canal to be moving more water to other parts of the state. And so although that's in the next map, this is kind of the idea is here, this helps us to be able to do some of those.
Position ourselves to do that, right?
So, I mean, we can leave that one on. The other ones that are on in multiple places here are the brackish groundwater desalination facilities. And the locations here are mostly based on the study that Montgomery and Associates did a few years ago.
Yeah, the one thing about that, I mean, Warren does have a comment about that, about the connection between ag exemption from water use limitations and creating new water for them if you address the waterlogging problem. But I think if we, as part of that, said there may be regulatory reform associated with it, that does not. I personally don't want to be doing a report that says we're going to start changing the limits on ag water use. I mean, because I think it's too early, because I don't think we even know if that would benefit. I mean, I understand Warren's concern is that now there's exemptions for ag on water use, but if we're going to create a project which actually gets them more, that solves the waterlogging problem for them, should they then, as to avoid creating it again, that it doesn't make any sense to take steps to ameliorate the water, too much water, and at the same time let them continue to use unlimited water, because you're not ever going to be able to get ahead of the problem. So I understand the issue. But like the transfer issue, the desal committee of the Governor's Water Advisory Group identified 4 or 5 areas where they were, and Jerry, jump in here if I say this wrong, where they hope to do a pilot brackish desal project. And none of those, they went out to those communities and not a single one of them were interested in doing them.
Yeah.
Now there were issues perhaps unrelated to that issue for why they were not interested at this time in doing them. But I mean, I guess my point is that it has I would say that the political sensitivity of that issue is equal to the transfer issue. And so we probably should make some kind of blurb on the brackish desal options, like we're putting on the transfer options, about closely working with area of origin, and because there were definitely, I mean, that they were ready, the governor's office was ready to fund the pilot project, and none of those areas were interested in doing it.
I'm not familiar, I don't mean to step into a big mess, but why? What is it?
Because it belongs to Yuma.
Well, that was the Yuma project, and that had lots of other things going on with bells and whistles, not related at all to.
There were 3 areas basically that they focused on.
Okay, 3, not 5.
One was they had originally looked at 5,
Okay.
and then some fell out. But the 3 that Bob Lotz really looked at, one was the Yuma groundwater mound, and obviously that got all embroiled in transfer-related issues. The other one was up around the Winslow Loop area, and absent a Navajo Hopi settlement or any discussions related to that.
Again, adjudication.
And then the third was the Buckeye.
Waterlogged.
Well, and the waterlogged area and the brackish groundwater area are separate from each other, but they are in roughly the same vicinity. And the big thing with that is there's no legal distinction between brackish groundwater and groundwater. So if you're within an AMA and you're pumping groundwater, you're pumping groundwater.
Yep.
So it's
A regulatory.
without regulatory revisions, it's just water. I mean, it's just groundwater. So there really was a big stall and.
So what I keep hearing is like, again, we were charged with bringing together a list of projects per planning area, but they're all fraught with political considerations. So it's almost like we have to have these ideas, but almost like I'm envisioning a table that shows these are the kinds of things you must do before you get to do this project. But I still feel like it's valuable to list the project.
Oh, absolutely.
Even though we know it's a target on our back.
Yeah. No, I think they need to be listed. I think they just need to be listed, kind of like in the transfer, we said there were certain things we were going to say wherever we were showing transfers, that we do the same thing wherever we're showing this brackish desal, because, I mean, clearly, and we are saying that general statement at the beginning, but I mean, clearly, obviously, the adjudication impacts that lots of places. Right. You know, the whole water transfer off the river got mixed up with the Yuma thing, but, you know, maybe someday we'll have that solved, maybe not. But I mean, I think they're all things that need to be on the list. I mean, that clearly is a water supply.
Right. So, but I do think that broader is better, because when you pick these specific projects, you call out those locations. And the Montgomery report it was derived for CAP's purposes, so there were areas that were selected. If you're going to do it, and I think that it's reasonable to have them on there and say there are augmentation options, maybe you need to go with the broadest list, which is not just those areas, but also in that appendices at the back, there were other areas that Montgomery and Associates identified as feasible. They had water, they had it within the relatively treatable TDS levels, and they didn't make it into the report because they didn't meet CAP's requirements. So I think if you're going to put it, I think what you say is, if there's a brackish groundwater supply there, then it gets this icon.
Then it should get the icon.
Because when you put any specificity on it, that's when you invoke the political sensitivity. Yeah. Right.
Right. So that if there's a list that we can then say that this is a list to identify where brackish desal is available in the state, and we put it on the map just as available.
Right.
Right. Because again, we're being very careful, you know, and obviously it's all in the packaging at the end of this, to say that, I mean, it started out with, we were careful about that wording, this was to create a portfolio of options for planning areas. So we're not trying to go into any local planning area and tell them what to do. I mean, I think part of that's going to be the real packaging of this overall report, that, you know, we recognize there's lots of things on this that are, you know, on this list that are very controversial, that will need lots of work with the communities at issue. We're simply listing things that, all things being equal, could be available in the planning area. Does that make sense?
Yep, okay. All right, let's move on to the next map. This is 0 to 16-year time period. And the concept here is that, and I need to explain the icons and symbology a little bit to make sure that we're not too confusing. The idea is that we could take ocean water and do an exchange with Colorado River users in California, so that we give them the desalinated ocean water and we take a portion of their Colorado River right, which we would then put through the CAP canal or use along the Colorado River to provide benefits to Arizona. So the three along the ocean on the west side are intended to be those. They are all in areas where there is some level of municipal development, so that desalinated water gets used for municipal use as opposed to agricultural use, where the price point is different. Then there is the one in the Gulf of California where we would take a pipeline and deliver it up into Arizona directly for use, where that would not necessarily be an exchange.
But could be an exchange.
It could be, but wouldn't have to be. Within each planning area here in Arizona, you can see the pump and pipeline, and those are not intended to specifically say a pump station and a pipeline. Those are symbols to represent that once we get the water into central Arizona through the canal or some other means, we could then, through exchanges or transfers or whatever, move that water to other areas. And so it may not be a physical pump station and a pipeline. It could be an exchange along the river where farther up the river someone could divert more water that normally would go to SRP, and then SRP would get the water that comes through the CAP. In some cases, it could be a pump station and a pipeline, and one example would be the Northwest Basins, where maybe we could pump water out of the river and go up to Kingman, and that would require diversion structure and a pipeline, but the Verde River, for example, would not necessarily need that infrastructure. Same idea with Upper Gila and Upper and Lower San Pedro.
So Richard, on diversion facility, we perhaps change that definition to be diversion via, new facilities, exchange, or transfer? Because it seems to me that when you define it as diversion facility for the unskilled person like me, that would make me think it was a physical facility.
Right.
Okay, so I think maybe we should just call it diversion as opposed to diversion facility.
Sure.
And then kind of define that as either via facility, exchange, transfer, whatever makes the most sense, depending on the volume and where it's going. Does that?
Yes, that helps.
Okay, all right.
And then also, we intentionally split out the projects you'll see from the list where there's the big project, which is the desalination, and the exchange with some other party to do that. Then within each of these planning area, we show those projects separate, and the reason we did that is because maybe not all of the planning areas would choose to buy in. So for a planning area, they could choose to not participate or they could choose to buy into it, and then they would have the infrastructure agreements or transfers to get water into their area, and in addition to it, they would have their portion of the cost of the desalination facility.
Right, okay.
And most of these projects here are all directed towards being able to use the water from these desalination facilities, either directly or indirectly.
Okay. Okay, and we're going to take agreement out on all of these?
Yes.
Okay, all right, that's good.
Now, we have transfers here in a number of places where we would be transferring water from one place to another, which is part of moving it around. I assume that that's okay?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to we're going to, just wherever we talk about transfers, if we're talking about specific transfers, we have to have this language about all the issues that go into being a transfer. I think here, why I'm saying let's just say diversion and say via exchange, transfer, or physical facility, then we're not calling out a specific transfer that I think we need to be as concerned about. We're basically just saying we would bring this large amount of water in from somewhere else, import into the state, and then once it got to the state, we would figure out the most appropriate way of, which is going to be largely driven by who's willing to pay for it.
I think this really begs for more narrative. I have trouble looking at it, sort of going, all right, what are we talking about? What's the water that's going to this place, and which direction is the water flowing, and you're really going to take water off for Verde? Is that, I think there are feasibility issues there. So maybe, I'm going to suggest something really radical, that this isn't the best use of try to explain this on a map is not the ideal use of maps, even though I'm map crazy. And I think I'd like to know what's the story here. It looks like there are 3 narratives or 5 narratives, and I'd like to know what are the narratives. Maybe it could be a numbered thing, and then a little paragraph explanation that says, this is what we're envisioning. This is what we're envisioning.
Okay.
It should help me.
Oh, so like over here where the legend is,
Yeah.
number each of these
Yeah.
projects,
Yeah.
and then have at least a few
like,
sentences
you know,
that then would
all
refer
very-
to the report, but at least
Yeah.
right on the map have.
Yeah, it's all very much in the conditional, possibly this could happen, but it would be helpful to be able to have a better sense for me of what's the chain of diversion and exchange that we're talking about here.
Okay. All right, we can do that. Part of what's also a little challenging with this is if you take any of these planning areas where there is not a CAP canal, but you could do some sort of exchange or transfer to get water to them, there's the mechanism to go from the CAP canal to that planning area, and then there's also the mechanism to get water to the CAP canal, and there could be multiple ways of doing that. In addition to these desalination locations we have shown, if there were transfers or agreements made, let's say for land fallowing in Yuma to do something, you could do that, which is an entirely separate kind of a project, and get the water to the CAP canal and then get it up into each of those planting areas. So
there always, I think this is back to the transfer discussion, there are always kind of infinite possibilities with willing parties.
yes.
But I think we're trying to narrow our focus to what are real, a little better than realistic, somewhere between realistic and likely solutions for long-term water supply or water resilience. And so, every farmer could, if they wanted, they could fallow, and that would give cities a lot more water. But that isn't really a strategy for augmentation in Arizona. That's not what this committee's, I think, it feels to me, I think what Bruce said before, we're really thinking more along the lines of infrastructure. So I don't know that we want to reflect something like farmers could fallow their fields and more water could be moved to cities, because we know that.
Okay.
And I don't think we formed this committee to make a recommendation that we, look at what farmers where that should happen or something. But here, where you have a desal, that's an issue that comes up a lot, a desal plant, how would it work? Who could benefit from the water? What would the investment take? Those are really categorically different.
Well, because you're talking, again, going back to your,
Yes.
you're talking about adding a new source, instead of just moving something
you're right.
around.
And I'm struggling, I think we all are,
It's absolutely.
but still, realistically, all the ag could solve all of the city's problems, and I'm being facetious, by stopping ag, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but that makes no sense, so
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
so that's
So
not
that's why I don't
something we
wanna
want
go
to,
there, right.
yeah, it's too big an industry in the
Definitely
state
not
to
something we want
recommend
to put our
that.
name on either,
Well, and it doesn't make sense anyway, honestly, ag's too much of
Right.
a part of the
Right,
state's
of
economy to suggest that, so
And
that is
there's
not,
so many other reasons to
Yeah.
have ag,
Like you
but-
said, it's like a water trend.
Yeah.
You're not augmenting here.
Yeah.
right.
Well, all these desal alternatives are possible, it's just a matter of money.
Yeah.
Right.
And a customer base, and I think that's what we want to reflect here. There are desal plants that are mothballed, even in California, and
Right.
so that's why desal is farther out there, and this is a chance to reflect that, is you have to have the critical mass of customers to make it work.
And price point, they're continuing to reduce the cost of
Yeah.
desal and dealing with the brine stream and all of that,
That's another issue.
so that, which goes to, so it's a combination of getting that price point down and the number of customers up to
Yeah.
reach that
Yeah.
critical point, which again is why we have that out in that 60-year time frame. Start talking about it now, then obviously there are discussions and even feasibility studies being done now on at least one of these. But but to get that discussion started, but recognizing that there's lots of issues between here and there.
But the cost issue raises some interesting questions where I've been curious about what the committee's opinion is on this. For desalination, I personally see that as something for municipalities as opposed to agriculture, just because of the price
Point, right.
And so then when we look at, what are the things that agriculture would be interested in paying for? Of all these things, about the only thing I come out with is conservation, and I don't know if that's necessarily good enough, or is that what you want?
Well, we've talked, right, this is different than what we talked about earlier in terms of encouraging agricultural water conservation.
No, but I think Richard's asking in terms of augmentation for ag. That we looked at, we were supposed to look at augmentation for M&I, industrial, and ag, at least at a first glance. And so I think his question was, Wade, what, are there any of these options on here that looks like something ag would be interested in paying for to augment their supply? Which I guess goes to the price point. Don't you to me, right? If...
Well,
can you afford it?
Yeah, and it depends on what agriculture you're talking about.
Right.
Down in Yuma, you're not going to give them to pay anything. They got all the water they need,
Right.
all the water they want, and all the water they can foreseeably
Right.
use in the future. So that's not the agriculture that's gonna need to acquire water and pay for water.
Right. Canal farmers, though, may very well be interested at some point in the future in augmenting their supply. And again, I think that the advantage of when you look at something like the desal that brings more water into the overall system for the state, then that becomes, once it's in the state, who's willing to pay to bring it in, and agriculture is going to be part of that discussion, at which point they can decide whether or not that price point is one that could support using it for agriculture.
Yeah.
Is that?
That's true. I mean, so for the desal, we don't necessarily have to say where it would be going.
No, that's what I'm saying. We're just saying it's coming into the state.
Right.
It could go anywhere. Who can afford it?
Yeah.
So that's, I wanted to kind of focus just a little bit and remind us what our steps were in this process, and although they have changed, if we say that this work that Richard has provided is analogous to the old task 2, it was more that superficial level. The information that you were talking about, Sarah, was a little bit farther down the road where they actually came to the committee and said, what things do you want us to look at in depth? I think we're at the product level right now of saying what's available in the planning areas over time without all of that detailed description at this point. So I just wanted a reminder. And I don't even know what the tasks are anymore because they've changed.
It's a little bit of chicken and egg, because we're trying to narrow, to sort of get to a narrowing. It's hard to narrow without some of the details that we're sort of asking for, thinking about now.
Right.
And this is where I think we would like some input, and where we're struggling, I think, a little bit with the original path of the project, which is to evaluate projects against each other and rank and score them. When we organize them this way, by time period and by planning area, it seems that the need for a lot of that goes away, and you can just apply common sense to say it makes sense that we do these things. And I also don't see the projects, in most cases, as being mutually exclusive. If there's a project for ag, then they want to do it, they should go do that regardless of where the project might be in the same planning area. And so it makes sense to me to focus our energies more on further definition where we can. I don't think we can get real specific in any planning area to deal with, like, locations of a particular augmentation project. But if the goal is to take things out to the planning areas, this concept that we have of a fact sheet where we would take each of the ones that the committee is interested in and put together a fact sheet that gives the information that someone in the planning area could evaluate that and decide based on the information and local knowledge that they have there what's most important. It seems to me that that's where we could provide you the most value. And so
those fact sheets become like a toolbox. It gives them a framework for each idea, and then it's really up to them whether or not and how to implement it.
It's kind of interesting because we're even kind of assuming that the planning area is a thing, and it's not. And there isn't like a person or an entity. I see the value of the fact sheet, but to me, I love it.
Well, but I think the question then, to go back in terms of what this Corolla's next task is for us, because we've kind of got offline and we have 10 minutes to go, is just that. Do we want them to do more about the phase thing for each in the fact sheets for the projects as opposed to the ranking? And I'm inclined to say yes.
Yeah.
But I'm, defer to committee members here.
We want a fact sheet for each, is the idea a fact sheet for each planning area or for each project? And for every single project reflected here?
I think for the project, but not, and then you would just reference the planning areas where that project would be, or what? I don't know, jump in.
Well, if we take brackish desalination, for example, we would come up with one fact sheet to have the information on brackish desalination, and then we could say, we think it may apply to these places.
I mean, there'll be no analysis planning area by planning area?
Right.
That's right.
Actually, on planning.
The planning area will have an icon of a brackish desal plant.
Right, so the planning area will have this list of options, and then they go to the fact sheet to have more definition of that option. A different part of that is, do we still want to identify 3 to 5 projects? Not do the ranking of all of them in relation to each other, but do we still want then also an identification of 3 to 5 projects to pass on to the GWAC committee to say if we want to do, because the idea was let's try and find some pilot project out of this whole thing that can get us in that direction we want to go. I'm almost thinking, and I don't know timing-wise and contract-wise, so I'm just throwing this out, that we might want to get those fact sheets and the planning area stuff revamped based on the discussion today before we can make that determination.
Selfishly, I'd like that.
Well, I just realistically think that, going back to what Sarah said, she kind of wants maybe a little more definition about some of this stuff before she even knows
How to
narrow that thing. And I'm not saying that necessarily requires another meeting other than the next one we would have scheduled. What we could do, Richard, is you could get the changes made, because I think I went back and looked at our list on the agenda. I really think we've covered everything that was on your list, probably not in the order, and Cindy's probably thinking, how am I ever going to make any sense of this? But
All recorded.
But I mean, that we have covered the questions you had on your list, other than this identification perhaps of this 3 to 5 projects, because we've now said we agree with not the prioritizing everything relative to each other, is get that out on the portal, these changes based on the discussion today, and then could ask the committee members to take a look at them and make a determination. One, are they okay with the changes as made? Do they reflect what we've done? 2, now that we've seen those fact sheets and the planning areas to which they're assigned, is there some value in identifying 3 to 5, and I'm almost thinking 3 at this stage, just given our discussion, projects that we then want to say may want to pick one of these projects, one of these 3 projects to do further work on. I know what I would say, but I'm not going to be on the committee, so my 2 cents on that's not going to count. So
You should still give your 2 cents.
Well, yeah, my 2 cents was I would like to see, as much as Warren says it's ridiculous to have it in there, the Missouri River and the desal, or at least one of those 2 really long-term projects on that list to get started with some kind of study.
It's worth much more than 2 cents.
Yes, thank you. Just because I think that was kind of the whole point of this, is trying to find a source for those millions of acre feet that I've identified as short. And that, again, while there are certainly areas of the state that we cannot identify where there's a gap, because we don't know what the supplies are, so we don't know if they're in fact. The majority of that number is driven by the urban areas. And this is, from the time CAP was a concept to the time that first drop of water came through was about 45 years, as I recall. Bill would know exactly.
Wasn't to 85 the
Yeah, right. So, I mean, it was a long time, so it is not too early.
I've been doing a lot of research about that time. Poor Susan has to endure. Today is Water History Wednesday, by the way, so watch out for the tweet.
I never knew that was a thing.
But what's very interesting is how Arizona referred to CAP so consistently as the rescue supply for Arizona until the first delivery was made, and then we started thinking of CAP as the growth supply.
Yeah.
Right.
It's funny how
It was the rescue.
Right.
It was the rescue.
Things change.
Certainly.
But, I mean, it's really the timing is my concern, that,
Yeah.
I mean, we keep
Yeah.
having these this is at least 10,
Yeah.
probably 15 years into me on several different statewide committees, where we talked about this long-term,
Yep.
that none of, these short things are all good for individual areas, but that next big bucket for the state, and it's like, oh, well, we'll talk about that later. Well,
It's later.
it's later. Yeah, I think it's later. So that's my parting comment. Richard, is there anything else you need from us before, because it's about time to...
Well, just to carry on with that thought for just a second, which is kind of the remaining thing I was looking for. in coming up with these fact sheets, these really big ones are going to take some additional work to come up with a good fact sheet for them, because there's so much there to think and analyze, and we can't do it all, but we could do something, and that was why I suggested maybe, at least one or two of those be part of the ones that we would investigate further, just so we can get to a good fact sheet and define the problem enough for you to use.
Okay, so now I think I'm confused. So you're saying not do fact sheets for all the things, just do fact sheets for 2 or 3 things?
No, I'm saying do fact sheets for all of them.
Okay.
But these big projects are so big, and there is so much that is undefined, that it will take some additional work just to be able to create a fact sheet for them. And for that reason, I was wondering if those are ones that the committee wanted to choose to dig a little bit deeper in, just so that we allocate a portion of the budget to be able to define a meaningful fact sheet, develop a meaningful fact sheet for those projects.
For the bigger long-term projects. Well, committee? I mean, I think that makes sense.
Yeah,
I mean, to me. Because, I mean, we've taken out that prioritization piece, so hopefully that frees up some time.
So I think by the bigger ones, you mean desal plants, possible water exchange.
Desal and the Missouri River one are what I'm talking about.
Which probably would never happen. So I'm wondering if we want to bother with the Missouri flood flows.
Well, here's the thing. Is desal our only option we want to look at?
That's my question.
See, and to me, no, because, I mean, the desal option assumes California is willing to work with us and doesn't want all that supply for themselves
Or
that would be developed, or that Mexico would be willing to
yeah.
work with us. And I don't know that I think those are any easier environmentally and politically than capturing flood flows somewhere, whether it's the Missouri or wherever. I mean, I don't know. Do I think that's a very pie-in-the-sky idea? Yes, I do. But do I also think that, the ability to bring in millions of acre-feet of desal, I think that's fairly pie in the sky as well, I mean, honestly. And yet, if we don't look at some of those, on the other hand, what we could do for both of those, I suppose, because certainly CAP and the state are undertaking, or the state are undertaking the U.S.-Mexico desal plant thing going on. So, I mean, there is some of that already in process. I guess the other option on those really long-term ones is just something that says, looks at how long the CAP took to develop, maybe look at some other projects in other states, those kind of big importation projects, and just have a discussion about the process for those big kinds of projects and the time frame, as opposed to trying to get into specifics, which we may not have, and I think we don't clearly have the money for that anyway. It's rather on those long-term projects, look at more kind of process steps and time frames. What does that?
My concern about the Missouri River one, there is an official discussion going on about ocean desal for Arizona.
Right.
I worry about the optics of a committee in Arizona, an official committee, starting to talk about taking water off the Missouri River and moving it across the country to Arizona. And I mean, that's just a concern that we would look like, that would be considered an outlandish idea at this point. And that, whereas we know we're safe with ocean desal. So I would want to...
Well, I would argue that we've got the 7-basin state study, which clearly talks about the importation from other river basins. So it's not like it's totally something this committee came up with.
It.
Yeah, but maybe what we do is on that is, instead of identifying another river basin, is just specifically is do it a generic importation from outside. From outside the area.
I like that.
And then maybe, Richard, that's where we do the process discussion, for example, and pick up a couple of examples and what the steps were and how long those projects took. So we don't identify the Missouri per se. Does that sound like a better middle ground? So we're, because, the Columbia River thing has to keep getting renewed. Sometime it might not get renewed. Scoop Jackson's you know, well, having it for a while, but, you know, as much as congressional legislation is ever permanent.
That's right. But if you leave it generic, the Columbia folks will come off the wall. They know you're looking at them.
At them, yeah.
Missouri is.
It's, yeah. Well, I mean, and maybe what we say is look at other river basins, out, you know, consider whether or not there are any basins outside of Arizona
Yeah,
that are, let's put it that way, consider.
right.
So not, you know, so the option is consider whether or not there are any outside basins outside this one, and then kind of use some examples of places where those have been, just to address the process and how long the time frame is. So if anybody does want to look at them, they know now's the time to start doing it. Is that?
Before all the states between us and that water supply grab it.
Well, yeah, I mean, Kansas is already, you know, on that path, as we saw this week, so. Right, exactly, so.
So Maureen, just so I understand, keeping kind of, sorta with the original scope of work, and let me ask you, Richard, it looks like more that task 3 would be creating these fact sheets, the not big fact sheets, but the fact sheets. And then task 4 would be more what you were just describing, Maureen, of the evaluation of desal, so essentially doing the fact sheet for desal, and the fact sheet for considering the availability of outside Arizona river basins, and that would be the next steps, and then we'd be done. Is that what you were asking, and is that what you were saying? I just want to make sure we're all talking the same thing.
It's similar, I maybe have a little bit of a twist on that. In the schedule, I was hoping that we could do the fact sheets for the many projects in parallel with the investigations for the big ones, if that's what you choose to do. Then we would come back and meet at a time when you could review those draft fact sheets to kind of close out that task. But I also had a task that was in task 5 that I sort of moved forward, and that was to start thinking about what do we want the content of the report to be, so that when we come back to meet again, maybe that's a part of our discussion. And then going away, if we do the analysis and the fact sheet tasks in parallel and think about what the agenda is, the content of the report is going to be, then we discuss that when we meet again. Then we could go away and produce a draft report, which we would then meet and review and then finalize. By doing it that way, I was able to move the schedule up so that we could finish in June rather than July, to get done in less than our 12-month period.
Well, I mean, time-wise, if you believe you can do those two together, especially since we've actually changed the investigation on the big ones to be a process review, I think that makes that less of a task. Maybe easy for me to say, but I think that makes that less of a task than if you were actually looking at physical infrastructure and feasibility and all of that, and if we're more looking at coming up with the kinds of things that would be included in the next step if we were to do one. Yeah. That makes sense. And I'm okay with that, sorry, but I'm, you know, defer to you. But I mean, the idea of them doing both of those in parallel. I don't think today, we clearly don't have time to talk about what the content of the report is.
Right.
But perhaps when you send the fact sheet out to us for review at the same time, you could remind us that you would like some input on how the content of the report would be structured.
Yeah, and we could give you a sample outline or something
Great.
to react to.
Great, that would be great. Does that sound good? And, okay, then I think we need to adjourn, but before we do, thank you all. I appreciate all your attention and time and work on this project, and good luck. I hope it becomes a final project. And Wade is going to be your new fearless leader.
Yay.
He has volunteered, and I really appreciate it. He knew I was thinking on everybody, and he has nicely stepped up to the plate. So, so he's the one who gets to take the heat for all these outlandish ideas. So I think the top of the list should be water transfers from Yuma.
Well, thank you for all your help and guidance.
Ray, do you have anything before we adjourn?
Maureen is living proof of not all good things last.
He's so sweet. Thank you, everybody, appreciate it. We are adjourned. Thanks, sweet. Good luck.
And it's on the
I tried to.